Welcome to The Big Picture. I'm Phil Arno. I was out the other night and ran into a couple of friends of the station, Bob and Mike, two guys from Cheektowaga who are retired and probably know more about the WBBZ schedule than I do. We talked about a lot of things, and not the least of which was the upcoming elections. And we agreed that Democrats and Republicans are pretty much giving us a clear choice this year. But how do you choose? It depends on the message that you like. Political ads, they're all over the place now. They're slick and they're smooth. They sound quite reasonable. But what's the substance behind them? In general, I hear Republicans talking about a thriving economy, lowest unemployment in 50 years, minority and women, they have the most jobs they've ever had, how lower taxes have stimulated 4% GDP, something Obama said was impossible. I hear how other countries have been charging us high tariffs for decades, while the U.S. charges almost nothing in return, and now we're getting tough and they're coming to the table. I hear how North and South Korea are finally reaching peace after 70 years, and how the U.S. is finally asking its allies to pay some of the expenses for some of their own protection. I hear that if you want to come to this country for a better life, you shouldn't crash the border or cut in line. You should come here legally, go through the process, like our grandparents did. What do I hear from the Democrat candidates? Well, I hear that Trump is a bad guy. He's racist. He hates women. He calls for violence. He's unpresidential. I hear that Collins has been indicted. That means, of course, that he's guilty. I hear that if you vote Republican, you're voting for the party of Trump, which stands for hate. I hear that Republicans are being mean to our allies, that Republicans are being mean to the poor immigrants who only want a better life. And oh, I love this one. I hear that lower taxes are actually bad for the people of this country. Now, I'm not trying to be biased here. I'm really not. Everything I've just explained is as matter of fact as I can be, just from my observations. One side is talking about running on quality of life issues and policies, the U.S. getting a fair shake in the world, and the other side is sending an emotional message, politically correct, social justice, hatred, character assassination. It's pretty clear cut. On The Big Picture with me today to discuss the issues of this very important election is political consultant Vic Martucci of Masiello, Martucci, Calabrese and Associates. Welcome, Vic. And
Thanks,
it's an interesting little debate that they have going on. And I'm not sure if you agree with my assessment of how the political ads are going.
Well, I think what's changed in politics today and in elections today is that it used to be that when candidates ran in the primaries, they would appeal to their bases, but they would appeal to their base in a way that would give them enough room to move back to the center, to try and attract those independents, which represent a large swath of the voting public. Today, that's not the case. Both parties are running base elections in the general election, and so their messages are tailored to their base more so than trying to move to the center to capture the middle. And what that has resulted in my opinion, is you have historic low voter turnout in this country. And it's because the vast majority that's in the middle have become so frustrated and so disenfranchised by the messaging out there that they don't vote anymore. And so that has a self-fulfilling prophecy kind of an effect, and it just reinforces the notion to the consultants on both sides that we need to continue to appeal to the base.
Well, you know, I was driving in today and I heard an ad for the Democrat who's running in New York 27. Mm-hmm. And he basically had an entire ad that was concentrated on the fact that Collins has been indicted. and that if it's a 2-year term, and that if Collins is elected, he could conceivably be in court for the entire 2 years, that he lied, and that and it basically concentrated on Collins' legal problems. It didn't say anything about what this candidate would do if he got in, if he was elected.
Right.
It didn't say anything about what Collins or Republicans do in Congress. It never mentioned any issue or policy. And that's basically what drives me crazy, is we're voting for government to do a job. We're not voting for a particular individual in his private life. You know, I mean, there's connections there. There's some relevance, but
right.
Mostly we're voting for our government to serve us in policy.
Let's talk about New York 27. If you're Nate McMurray, or you're advising Nate McMurray, the candidate that's running against Chris Collins in New York 27, when you look at that district, Donald Trump carried that district by 24 points in 2016. Mitt Romney carried that district by 12 points in 2012 against President Obama. So your message on an issue basis won't sell in New York 27 if you're Nate McMurray. So if you want to win, how are you going to win that race? You're going to win that race by convincing people that Chris Collins does not deserve to be reelected. And how do you make that argument that he doesn't deserve to be reelected? Well, you can't point to his record. You can't point to his policy positions, because Chris Collins's policy positions are aligned with the majority of the voters in his district. So you have to convince people that there's another reason to change. And the reason to change is that this man's under indictment. The implication is that he's guilty, and that he won't serve out the full 2-year term. And that's the only way, frankly, that Nate McMurray can win in New York 27, is if he convinces people that that is the overriding issue, regardless of policy position.
Well, it's an interesting dynamic that whenever you say that a candidate can't win on what he's going to do when he gets in, so you know that always drives me crazy, because as I said before, we're voting for somebody based on what they're going to do when they get in,
right? And
you know,
right. Well, and by the way, and that's why I really believe that Chris Collins is going to win that election. And it's based on the most recent polls. There have only been 3 public polls that I'm aware of in New York 27. There was one that was done right at the beginning of October, and that had it as a dead heat. And then the Siena poll that came out a couple of weeks ago had Chris Collins up by 3. And there's a more recent Siena New York Times snapshot poll, which had a much bigger sample, that has Collins up by 4. But when you look at the crosstabs, when you look at the fundamentals of the poll, Collins's lead gets bigger when you look at the type of voters that are more likely to vote. That, in combination with the fact that Collins is banking on the fact that people in that district are not going to vote for somebody who will support Nancy Pelosi for Speaker, and will support policies that are just an anathema to a majority of people in New York 27.
That's interesting. There's a couple of radio announcers in the afternoon, radio commentators that you know say that they're very conservative, and yet you know they can't quite get themselves to be positive about Chris Collins. You know, they kind of choke it back because they don't like him personally, and you know they want to support a Republican, but they criticize him back and forth, and I'm not sure where they're going with it. You know.
Well, that's going to be the fundamental question on Election Day, is whether or not Republicans will even vote for that particular office. the Republicans that do come out and vote, whether or not they just sit it out and they'll vote for every other office on the line because they can't get past the fact that Chris Collins is under indictment. That really is going to tell whether Chris Collins gets reelected or not, and it's very hard to predict.
Well, you know, I know that he's under indictment, and most people, they read the indictment or they hear that okay, this guy's been indicted and he's in trouble, and that means that he's going to be gone, and you know, nobody escapes those legal problems, and it's an ironclad case. I don't see it that way. I see, you know, everything that I've heard. Okay, and this isn't really the prime subject of today's show, but if you look at what happened, and I know Chris Collins, I know the kind of guy he is. He's very emotional, and yet as a businessman, he's very into himself. He thinks that he's got judgment that can't be questioned because, you know, he's very successful, and, you know, he's got this record of knowing, you know, what's best. So he's invested in this firm, and he's very convinced that this firm is going to be very successful. He tells all his friends, everybody he meets, that this thing is going to be tremendous success. And for years and years and years, he believes that. And then suddenly he gets the news that it's a failure. And his expectations for all these years just goes right down the drain suddenly, right out of the blue. Now he gets on the phone and he calls his son. And we know that he called his son. And then his son calls everybody and says, sell the stock. Well, we don't know what took place in the conversation. Just for the sake of argument, assume for a second that Collins is very upset, calls his son and says, look, I know we're supposed to get together. I know we talk on a regular basis. I'm not feeling too good. Just count me out for the next week or so. I'm just not going to be up to anything. And his son says, what's wrong? And he says, well, I've just got some bad news and I just need to deal with it. And his son says, is everybody okay? And Collins says, it's not a health problem and it's nothing to do with politics, but I can't talk about it. Which is legally, he can't talk about it. So his son, not being a dummy, says, well, it's not a health problem and it's not a political problem. There's only one other thing that his father is really invested in, and that's the business. Now, they hang up and his son says, well, being a smart investor, I'm going to assume that business, my dad is upset because he got some bad news. So I'm going to hedge my bet and I'm going to get out. And I'm going to tell my friends to get out too. According to that scenario, no law has been broken. No inside information has been passed. If that's the case, he hasn't done anything illegal.
Yeah, I mean, none of us could possibly know what the Justice Department has in terms of evidence. There's a couple things that I know about cases like this. Number one, proving insider trading is a very difficult thing for the government to do. It's a very high bar. The more likely scenario is that they would be able to get him on civil charges as opposed to criminal charges. The bar is much lower for that. But secondly, what you can't get past is that Chris Collins lost millions of dollars. He didn't sell one share of stock,
which goes along with what the scenario I just laid out.
But in the context of our conversation, you know, we live in a society today where when somebody gets indicted, they're presumed to be guilty. When somebody gets accused, they're presumed to be guilty. So the dynamics of this race are, how will the voters in New York 27 filter all of that information? You have a Democrat candidate that they know does not align with them in terms of their values and their policy positions. And they know what he'll do if he gets elected. And you've got Chris Collins, who's under indictment, yet you know that his positions on the issues more closely align with yours. And you know that the control of the House of Representatives is in the balance, is being held in the balance. And if you lose a district like New York 27, how could the Republicans possibly maintain control of the House? That's what people are going to be filtering. And it'll be interesting to see how it plays out next Tuesday.
Well, that's all the time we have for this break. I will leave the audience with one question, and that is, you know, think about how that scenario plays out in light of the fact that in Salem, Massachusetts, there was a similar attitude about the accused being judged guilty that took place a couple hundred years ago.
Yeah.
Anyway, we'll be back right after these messages.